Good morning, everyone. This is Nick Martin of the American Carbon Registry. Thanks very much to all of you for taking the time to join in for a webinar this morning on our draft grazing land and livestock management greenhouse gas methodology. I want to begin by just giving a brief outline. I'm going to speak for a few minutes about the sort of general background structure of the methodology, as well as the core module, which is called the framework module. This is a methodology developed in modules, as I'll explain in a minute. Then we'll hear from Nancy Harris about the module for accounting for microscale impacts. Then from Tim Pearson about accounting small and large-scale impacts. And then finally from Lauren Nichols about the leakage approach in the methodology. We'll then go to question and answer. We have a fair bit to present this morning, but we'll aim for at least a half hour, hopefully more like 40 minutes of question and answer at the end. Just quickly on the logistics, you have two ways of asking us questions. You have a chat box that's in the bottom of your webinar pane. You can type questions into that chat box. They'll come through to me, and I will be able to ask those questions at the end. You also should have a little bar along the right or left side of your webinar pane with a hand, and if you click that, you'll be raising your hand, and that will hold your place in line to ask a question yourself. I'll be able to see those hands raised and go to you to ask your question. I wanted to emphasize that this methodology is in draft form. It's currently open for public comment through January 31st. So we are encouraging everyone to submit written comments, and as well, all the comments we receive, questions we answer in this webinar will be addressed and posted with the public comment documentation. The webinar itself will also be recorded. This presentation, as well as a recording of the actual webinar, will be posted to our website. Quick background on the American Carbon Registry. ACR is the first voluntary greenhouse gas registry in the country. Has registered about 37.5 million tons of CO2 from various project types since 1996. We are a nonprofit organization, part of a parent nonprofit called Winrock International. In terms of what we do, there's basically 4 or 5 things. We develop and approve carbon protocols, like the one you're going to hear about today. When projects come to us developed under one of those methodologies, we review those documents and register the projects. We also require an independent third-party validation and verification by entities approved by ACR and accredited by independent bodies. We oversee that process. Fourth, the registry serves as a platform for transparently tracking all transactions and retirements, so that people in the market, sellers and buyers, can have confidence that the tons that they are buying or retiring have only been used once. And finally, in our most recent role, ACR was approved late last year as an offset project registry for the California cap-and-trade market. So in that capacity, we are registering compliance offset projects under protocols approved by the California Air Resources Board, and playing many of those same functions for the California market. In 2011, there were about 3 million ERTs, emission reduction tons, sold, retired, and contracted on ACR at an average price of $5.50. I wanted to just say a little bit about our parent nonprofit, Winrock. I have our mission statement there at the top. The interesting thing to emphasize here, Winrock is short for Winthrop Rockefeller, and Winthrop was sort of the black sheep of the Rockefeller family, who left the East Coast, went to Arkansas, bought up a bunch of farmed out cotton lands and started raising livestock. And the predecessor organizations to Winrock, the Livestock Research and Training Center, International Ag Development Service, and Ag Development Council, were all very much agricultural organizations, and that's been an important part of Winrock's history and current mission up to the present. So really, Winrock's mission is very much concerned with poverty alleviation, food security, yield improvement, those things that have been part Rockefeller institution emphases since the beginning. And now with our very real concern about climate change and its impacts on the poor and disadvantaged, we have it's been a big focus for us to look for ways to both mitigate and adapt to climate change by helping to connect agriculture to greater productivity, enhance competitiveness, and while maintaining or increasing yields at the same time as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really core to Winrock's mission, as well as what ACR is trying to do. Just briefly, this is from the U.S. EPA greenhouse gas inventory. You can see that agriculture represents about 6% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Half of that is nitrous oxide from fertilizer applied to agricultural soils. Almost the other half, 210 million metric tons, is emissions from livestock. So that includes 141 million metric tons from enteric methane, another 50 from manure methane. I think I have a figure wrong there. It's not 70. It's 52 according to the chart. And most of that, almost all of that half of the pie comes from beef and dairy cattle. And I guess you could consider that part of the other half of the pie, and nitrous oxide from ag soil management, is from producing feed for livestock. So in a sense, livestock are responsible for more than just the half that's directly attributed to livestock. So really significant sources of emissions. We think really significant and largely untapped opportunities to mitigate these emissions, because the existing and well-known methodologies mostly concern dairy, manure, biodigesters, and so on, and that's an important piece. You see that there, but it doesn't address a lot of the potential emissions, and this gives you a sense why we took on this methodology. I wanted to thank the funder of the methodology, the Packard Foundation, as well as a grazing, land, and livestock methodology technical advisory committee that we put together, whose names you see here. They've been tremendously helpful in bouncing initial drafts off of them, and their input has gone into the drafts that are now up for public comment. They'll continue to be involved going forward. In terms of our objectives overall for this project, mostly today we're going to be talking about the first objectives, which is a comprehensive methodology to unlock large-scale greenhouse gas reduction from the beef and dairy sector. So not limited to just manure biodigesters, but enteric, manure, fertilizer, fossil fuel, and enhanced biotic sequestration in soils and plants. We have a methodology here that's focusing on all those sources, including accounting methods for all of them. It's got a flexible modular structure, which I'll talk about, and another thing that's new to this methodology, sort of tiered accounting methods. The project does have some other objectives. It includes economic and spatial analysis. It includes a field testing stage where this methodology, once completed, will be tested and at several dairy and beef operations, and subsequently revised in response to the results of that testing, trying to make sure that the methodology that we've put together is amenable to the kinds of data that producers have and to broad uptake by producers. So I mentioned the modular structure. The methodology, I'll show the structure of it in just a minute, but the modular idea is that rather than writing a full standalone methodology for a very specific baseline and project activity, we wanted to create flexibility to include multiple practices. I have some example practices listed in the blue box there, but those are not really specified in the methodology, and the methodology is not limited to those. Those are all just things that can be done. And there may be other ways that livestock producers come up with also, things that can be done to reduce emissions in any of these 5 areas: enteric, manure, fertilizer, fossil fuel, and biotic sequestration. So really what the methodology does is create modules for accounting for each of those things, giving the methodology user flexibility. It also gives flexibility to expand the methodology in the future to additional accounting, additional things that need to be added without having to sort of recreate the whole methodology. This is a graphical representation of the structure. So there's a framework module, which I'll spend the rest of my presentation talking about. That sort of ties the methodology together. Inputs to that methodology are each of those 5 sources, greenhouse gas sources and carbon pools, biotic, fertilizer, manure, enteric, and fossil fuel. And for each of those areas, there are accounting modules for different scales of impact. So you see large, small, and micro scale impacts. Those are different accounting modules. I'll talk about those on the next slide. But on this, I wanted to also point out that there is at the end of this accounting process, there's also a required method to account for leakage, and that comes back into the framework module as a potential deduction from credited emissions. And there's, at the top there, you see the ex-ante estimation tool. That's something that Nancy will talk about. That's what sort of dictates what level of accounting module has to be used. So in terms of the tiered idea, this is something new to this methodology. We wanted to have the sort of required complexity or data requirements of the methodology tailored to the anticipated or estimated level of greenhouse gas impacts. So that for very small impacts, we didn't want people to be required to use very complex accounting procedures, but we still wanted to maintain the most rigorous accounting for the really significant emission sources. So the way we did that is there's an upfront tool called MicroScale, which calculates, which does an upfront calculation of emission reductions for each of the sources, and also provides in this ex-ante tool an estimate that basically tells the user whether the impacts in a particular pool or source are very small, and they can simply use the outputs of that microscale module, or whether, and that's defined, these are absolute thresholds, that's defined as less than 5,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Secondly, whether they're sort of a small scale impacts between 5,000 and 60,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, in which case the user has to use the small scale module, which is based on COMET 2.0, or for any impact in a source that exceeds those thresholds, either 5,000 for enteric and manure or 60,000 for fertilizer and biotic, has to use the larger scale accounting modules. The reason the threshold for the large scale accounting module is lower for enteric and manure is only that COMET 2.0 does not provide accounting for those sources. So currently, that has to be, the large scale accounting modules have to be used for those. There's some prospect of that changing in the future as COMET Farm becomes available. Finally, I mentioned there's a leakage module, and there's only for biotic sequestration, which is potentially reversible, there's a risk buffer assessment tool. So the framework module, as I said, is the top level module required in all cases. It gives the structure and functionality of the methodology. It gives guidance when you have to use or when it's optional to use other modules. It includes applicability conditions for the methodology, although the modules include some additional applicability conditions specific to those modules. It gives guidance on defining the project boundary, both the sort of geographic or physical boundaries, as well as the temporal boundary and the greenhouse gas sources, sinks, and reservoirs that are included or excluded from accounting. It gives guidance on demonstrating additionality. It gives a final formula to calculate emission reduction tons, which is really, there aren't many calculations in the framework module. That just has to do with summing the outputs from the other modules. It gives monitoring requirements, and it gives rules for aggregates and programs of activities. The project boundary, which is defined in the framework module, is all facilities and lands where livestock are held, fed, and grazed in the baseline in the project. That includes all the entities over which a project proponent has effective control, so it could be multiple commercial entities. And it also could include analytical units corresponding more to animal management than specific land areas. since livestock are held on different lands at different times of the year or different parts of their life cycle. No lands or facilities where emissions may increase due to the project activity are allowed to be excluded from the project boundary. Temporal boundaries. These three key temporal periods are defined. The start date, which is the discrete date when project management diverges from baseline management. Of course, the specific definition of that could be different depending on what is the project activity. So that has to be defined in the greenhouse gas project plan. A program of activities could have multiple start dates, and I'll talk about that later. Secondly, the crediting period. That's the time frame over which the baseline that's defined up front is valid and credits can be generated, and that can be renewed. That crediting period is 10 years for all the impacts, enteric, manure, fertilizer, and fossil fuel, except for biotic, in which the crediting period is 40 years. Finally, the minimum project term is the length of time that a project proponent commits to monitoring and verification. And as for forest carbon projects, that time period is 40 years for projects that want to claim credit for biotic sequestration. Now, of course, a project could if that time period is longer than a particular producer or project proponent is willing to commit, a project can still claim credit for reductions in the other sources and in that case have no minimum project term. So that's the case as long as the reductions are irreversible. There is no minimum term. I won't go through these in detail. I just wanted to reproduce here the greenhouse gas boundary. So the sources, greenhouse gas sources that are included or excluded. The general principle here is that a source has to be included unless it's demonstrated to be insignificant, de minimis, or it's conservative to exclude it. Excluding that source will tend to underestimate rather than overestimate greenhouse gas, net emission reductions. And the same applies for carbon pools. Really, any of these except for deadwood and litter may be included, and different types of livestock management, grazing land activities could cause creditable increases in any of those carbon pools. On additionality, the framework module defines basically 4 requirements. There's a start date requirement. If the start date proposed in the greenhouse gas project plan is more than 1 year before submission of the plan, the proponent has to provide evidence that greenhouse gas mitigation was a project objective from the beginning. Secondly, the project proponent has to demonstrate that the activity is regulatory surplus, or surplus to regulations, so it's not mandated by any applicable regulation, such as an odor control requirement or something like that. Thirdly, there's the option of a performance standard. So there's the option of a positive list where activities for which the baseline adoption rate can be demonstrated to be very low in a particular region are simply deemed additional without the requirement of project-specific additionality demonstration. We currently don't have anything in that positive list because we didn't at this time find sufficient data on practices to demonstrate that these, on adoption rates of practices. But we created that potential in the methodology so that project proponents can submit data to ACR demonstrating that practice is at less than 5% adoption in a reference region, and then they're not required to do the project-specific additionality demonstration. But finally, and this is for all activities currently and all activities that don't in the future exist on the positive list, there's a 3-prong test option. So as long as you've already shown this activity is surplus to regulations, if you can show it's not common practice and it faces at least one implementation barrier using an ACR approved additionality tool, that practice can be considered additional. There's provisions in the methodology for accrediting of early adopters, and this comes from a RICE methodology that's in development at ACR and was transferred over to this methodology. So, and this is relatively new. It's driven by the idea that producers who have already been doing an activity that may be at very low baseline adoption rate in their industry, in their region, would in effect get no credit if the baseline were project specific. The baseline, the project activity would be the same as the baseline, and there would be no credits generated. And that's the logic of that argument has to do with the environmental integrity of the program. That's an important thing to consider. It's also important to consider that in many of agricultural sectors, decisions are year to year, and a producer can reverse an earlier decision. We didn't want to create a perverse incentive for producers to stop doing an activity just to be able to restart it as a carbon project. And we also have heard in one meeting after another from agricultural producers that rewarding action by the industry leaders is really critical to get others to take up an activity. So the way we've done that here is to say that activities with less than 5% adoption are allowed to use a baseline that's based not on their own activities but on a common practice baseline. Those adoption rates have to be assessed through surveys or expert opinion, but there's no allowed renewal of the crediting period after 10 years if the adoption rate is below 5%, because in that case we feel that the incentive is not working. There must be other barriers to adoption. Activities with greater than 5% adoption can still demonstrate project-specific additionality and use a project-specific baseline. This is just the ERT calculation. So at the end of the module, these parameters, E, ENT for enteric, E, MAN for manure, and so on, are outputs from each of the modules and are summed together in this module. The buffer percentage parameter comes from the risk tool, which is used just for biotic sequestration to assess the risk of reversals. And the leakage parameter, ELK, comes from the leakage module that includes both activity shifting leakage and market effects leakage. The module gives general guidance on monitoring and verification. The monitoring period can be a minimum of 1 to a maximum of 5 years. Field verification is required every 5 years. If the proponent wants credits issued more often, they may do desk audits in between. Validation is just once per crediting period. What to monitor? You have to monitor all the parameters that are listed in the relevant accounting module that you're using. You have to monitor the project boundaries and all the field data. Stratification is recommended, and conservativeness principles are required. Finally, I'm going to finish up with, there's an annex to the framework module that talks about rules for aggregates and programs of activities, recognizing that these types of projects are very likely to happen in this way. So an aggregate is multiple project participants that are grouped together as one project coordinated by an aggregator. It has a single project boundary that's defined broadly enough to encompass all the project participants, a single start date and crediting period. And in this case, the aggregation is an important mechanism to reduce transaction costs of project development, validation, and verification, and also potentially to reduce uncertainty in the case of modules that use a process-based model where model structural uncertainty goes down with increasing number of participants or increasing number of acres. Secondly, programs of activities are multiple cohorts. Each cohort is likely an aggregate itself, but these cohorts are incrementally added to a project over time. So up front, the project proponent prepares a greenhouse gas plan with the initial cohort, but that also sets baseline, additionality criteria, and monitoring methodology for the entire project, which is an anticipated addition of cohorts, maybe every year or every couple of years. And so the project will have multiple start dates and crediting periods. There's an abbreviated validation for later cohort descriptions, which is the addition of another cohort to the POA. The rules for these, just in brief, aggregates, all the project boundaries are defined, the baseline additionality are all defined at the aggregate level. The accounting thresholds apply at the aggregate level. So if considering your whole aggregate, you exceed the 5,000 ton emission upfront estimate, you have to use the small scale module, for example. For a program activity, the program of activities, the greenhouse gas project plan has to provide very clear criteria for the addition of cohorts, has to provide clear documentation control for the multiple cohorts and crediting periods that are going to be part of the project. There's a procedure to avoid double inclusion or the inclusion in a cohort of any project activity that might be included in another cohort or in an aggregate already registered. And there's no allowed planned exceedance of accounting thresholds with later cohorts. So the ex-ante estimate is for the entire crediting period, and if you intend to add enough cohorts that you would exceed a threshold, a 5,000 or 60,000 ton threshold, during, over the span of a 10-year crediting period, you have to use the larger scale accounting module from the start. Finally, there's a prohibition on debundling. So debundling is the splitting of project participants from an aggregate or of cohorts from a program of activities in order to stay below the source, sink, and reservoir accounting thresholds. And there's methods in there to detect what would constitute debundling. If a project were registered by the same project proponent in the same category within the previous 2 years, or with a project boundary within 1 mile of the boundary of the proposed activity of cohort, those would be considered debundling, and that project activity would not be allowed to be registered as part of an existing aggregate or cohort. So that's all I have. I'm going to turn it over now to Nancy to discuss the microscale approach.
Okay, thank you. As Nick mentioned earlier, we took a tiered approach to developing this methodology, trying to make the level of effort involved by project developers proportional to the magnitude of the estimated impacts. So the cutoffs for which tier to use, microscale, small scale, and large scale, correspond to different cutoff values for emission reductions, depending on whether the project is located either within the U.S. or outside the U.S. So in a way, the magnitude of the estimated impacts will determine which accounting approach to use. We've got a delay here. There we go. But you also need an accounting approach to know what the magnitude of your estimated impacts are. And so it all comes across as a little bit circular. And we need to start the circle somewhere, and that's what we do in this microscale tool. The microscale tool is a fully automated Excel spreadsheet tool that applies simplified accounting procedures to give project developers a sense of what the impacts are of a particular project, or at least the order of magnitude of impacts, without having to furnish a ton of information that might be difficult or costly to obtain. And so the Excel tool has different tabs, one for each source category. We have biotic, enteric, manure, fertilizer, and fossil fuels. And once the user goes through the tool to generate an estimate of emission reductions for each of these 5 source categories, the output feeds into the ex-ante tool and tells you which accounting modules should be used for your particular project. So I'm just going to go quickly through each of these 5 source categories of the Excel tool just to demonstrate what kind of information is needed for each tool and how the tool functions. But I should also mention that we do have documentation for this tool that allows you to read through all the underlying calculations and how all the estimates are generated. Our goal was to be as transparent as possible while still maintaining some kind of interface that's user-friendly and not overwhelmingly eye-crossing. The first module is biotic sequestration. It's based on IPCC Tier 1 accounting, where the project developer is asked to enter the geographic region, the climate region, the soil type, the size of the project area. All of that allows the tool to automatically pick out IPCC default values that are applicable to the project and goes through all the calculations automatically. For all of these tools, all of the blue boxes, all of the boxes that are shaded in light blue here, require data entry by the user. So the user is asked to enter what's happening in the project under all of these baseline and project scenarios. For example, are you switching land cover types from cropland to grassland? Are you changing tillage practices? Are you converting from degraded to improved grassland? Are you planting trees? All of these boxes have explanations that you can click on, for example, right here under land cover type. And that really is intended to guide the user in explaining what each choice means. And once you fill in the boxes, the yellow box up at the top gives you an output value of emission reductions that's then fed into the ex-ante tool, which I'll show in a little bit. The next tool is for enteric fermentation. This module is a little bit more data intensive than BIOTIC, just because as we were developing the tool, we discovered that the IPCC Tier 1 accounting approach was really much too simplified to be meaningful at the project scale. So for this tool, we apply the same accounting approach as the large-scale module, which Tim will talk about in a little bit. But to simplify it, we provide defaults for some of the values required to make the data collection process a little bit less onerous. The calculations are based on gross energy intake, or how much energy an animal needs for maintenance and for activities such as growth and lactation and pregnancy, as well as what the animals are eating, which kind of determines the ruminant chemistry. So just like BIOTIC, we have baseline and project scenarios, and for each scenario the user is asked to enter data about different categories of livestock here up at the top. And you can click on each category to read a little description of what we mean, for example, by mature females. So the calculations calculate gross energy intake for a representative animal per subcategory, and that information is combined with information on diet composition. The information we ask is hopefully information that a producer will know, such as how many animals they have in each category, how many are pregnant, what the feeding regime is. But these gray boxes here are unique in that we thought it might be more difficult for producers to have this type of information readily available, such as the average weight of the animal, average daily weight gain, total milk production. So we provide values, default values that a user can change to more project-specific information if they know it, but we do provide some level of default. Again, after the user goes through and enters the data, the resulting difference in emissions between baseline and project will be displayed in this yellow box up here. Next is manure management. Again, we discovered that the IPCC Tier 1 calculations were too simplified to be useful at the project scale, so we move up to a Tier 2 approach, where the user is asked to specify under baseline and project scenarios how much manure is managed in both baseline and project scenarios. These proportions are fed into the calculations that estimate methane and N2O emissions. Just running quickly through these. The fourth one is fertilizer use. It follows IPCC Tier 1 methods, and emissions are calculated from the application of both synthetic and organic fertilizers under baseline and project scenarios. Both direct and indirect emissions are estimated. We also account in this module for the emissions resulting from the production of fertilizer. One thing to note about all of these calculations in general is that not every change in practice is going to result in an emission reduction. For example, changing a practice may result in an emission reduction in one source category, but increase emissions in another. So it's important to know what the overall balance of emissions and emission reductions is for a particular project type, and that's where the microscale tool comes in handy. We can get a quick overview of the order of magnitude of total benefits. Last is fossil fuel use, which requires information about how much of each type of fuel is being used under baseline and project scenarios. This applies an IPCC Tier 1 methodology and is fairly straightforward. One thing we did build into each of the tools, not just fossil fuels, but each of the tools is a unit converter. So if the user has information, for example, in gallons instead of liters or acres instead of hectares, the tool will automatically use whatever information the user has to do the calculations. The user doesn't have to sit there and do the conversions themselves. Finally, after the user enters all of the information into each of those 5 tabs, they go to the ex-ante page shown here, which will indicate which modules will be needed depending on the magnitude of estimated benefits. The final selection of modules takes into account uncertainty deductions as well. So in this example for enteric, fertilizer, and fossil fuels, they all resulted in emission reductions less than 5,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. So the project developer can use these calculations and doesn't have to go any further. Because the size of the impact in these categories is small, they're not overly burdened with having to go through the process of more involved data collection that the small scale and large scale methodologies might require. This allows just kind of the wise data collection practices in the areas that are most crucial to get right, and uses rigorous methodologies that are proportional to the size of the impact. So after a user knows which modules they need to use, and that some of them for example, A-BIOTIC and MANURE, require a higher tiered accounting methodology. They then go to those specific modules, and Tim is going to walk us through how each of those higher tier modules work.
Okay, Paul, do I have control? Okay, well, so my name's Tim Pearson. I'm going to talk about the next stage in the accounting, the larger emission sources, taking you through the small scale and the large scale modules. So if we start with the small scale, we're giving an option between the most detailed large-scale accounting approaches and the very small emission sources that allow us to use something close to IPCC Tier 1 methods. And this is applicable only in the United States because we're taking advantage of work done by Colorado State University and others producing the COMET tools in the US for accounting agricultural emissions. So we equate this with small-scale emissions under the Clean Development Mechanism, and so we're looking at emissions that are less than 60,000 tons of carbon dioxide. And so this is between the 5,000 limit of the microscale and 60,000. We also have the additional constraint, much as the Clean Development Mechanism does, that the direct emission cannot be more than 60,000 tons. So even if the change is fairly small, if you're looking at a small change on a huge emission, we still require you to use a higher level than you might otherwise. So starting with the small scale, as Nick mentioned earlier, this is applicable currently for biotic sequestration, so soil carbon sequestration, fertilizer emissions, and for fossil fuel emissions. It's currently not applicable for enteric emissions or manure emissions, though we are expecting to be able to expand this when we transition from Comet 2 to Comet Farm, which will include these emission sources, but those are not currently available. So the data inputs you're looking for small scale, again, you're in the continental United States and you're counting soil carbon, fossil fuels, and fertilizer. You're going to have to give information on the historic management of a specific piece of land, how you're going to plan to manage your specific piece of land under the project, the soil types, fertilizer inputs, and fossil fuels. As I said, it uses Comet 2.0, which defines itself as a user-friendly, web-based tool that provides estimates of carbon sequestration and net greenhouse gas emissions from soils and biomass for U.S. farms and ranches. It essentially uses an IPCC Tier 2 method for estimating emissions. As I said, we're hoping to expand in the fairly near future to allow us to also have this small-scale emissions calculation for manure and fertilizer. So the real advantage of this approach is that it takes fairly simple data inputs and all the calculations are done on an online program, and so there's less room for confusion or error, and also the inputs should be readily available. So here's an example of how you would go through the Comet 2.0 tool. You'd start off defining your state and the county in which your activity is taking place. Then for all the specific parcels, you'd give a name to the parcel and the size in acres of the parcel. You then give some detail about what the soil type is in each parcel, fairly simple coarse level, whether it's a clay or a loam or a sand or a silt or a combination, and whether it's a hydric soil. And then for multiple periods in the past, you're going to give information about how this piece of land was used so that the model is able to develop an understanding of what the soil carbon situation is going to be. So it looks at a historic period, which would be from 1880 to 1970, a modern period, as it defines it, from 1970s to the mid-1990s. What's happening now, which would be from the late 90s through to today. And then you go on to project into the future. And for each of those time periods, you give some information about how the land was used. So for example, in this current period, you might say it's currently in a rotation of corn and hay, with 2 years in corn and 4 years in hay. And you'd have to say something about what the soil disturbance would be. If you were going to have heavy tillage, then that would be intensive, and or you could have reduced tillage or no tillage at all. Also irrigation. And then this would be your project in the projection period. It's a grazing and livestock management project, so we really are probably going to be looking at pasture or range. And in this example, it would be a light use with rotational grazing and no fertilization. The model, and then you have to put in information for your entire rotation that you've given details of for your fertilizer input. So here you can show a higher input of fertilizer in the 2 years of corn and a lower amount in the 4 years of grass or hay, and the time of year and whether there's manure and whether there are inhibitors used, just so you can fully define the fertilizer situation. And the model then gives you an estimate of your emissions, both in the baseline scenario and the project scenario. And the difference between the two is obviously the benefit of the project. You can see in this case there is a net sequestration in the baseline and a much larger sequestration in the project case. The project is responsible for that, and so that's the emission reduction. You can show a slight increase in emissions from fertilizer, but the decrease in sequestration is much greater, leading to a significant emission reduction. If you're not able to use small scale, for example, if you're international and more than 5,000 tons of carbon dioxide, or if the particular emission source in applying the ex-ante tool indicates that it's going to be a large emission source, more than 60,000 tons of carbon dioxide, then you go into using the large scale modules. So there are four: the biotic module, the enteric module, the manure module, and the fertilizer module. So we're starting with the biotic, the soil carbon sequestration module, and it has to be used if emissions from soils are going to be higher in the project than the baseline, or if sequestration would be higher in the baseline than the project. In any other case, it would be optional. Where you're including biotic sequestration, this large-scale module has to be used, as we said before, in the US, where your direct emissions are more than 60,000 tons, and internationally, where they're more than 5,000 tons. There's a range of data inputs into this. We're talking the large scale now, so these are significant emission sources, but information will be needed on your tillage, your type of tillage, your depth of tillage, and how often tilling is happening. Livestock, numbers of livestock, type of livestock, and what happens to the manure that's produced from that livestock, and if any additional manure is applied to the land. Grasses, what's the type of grasses, what's the productivity, how that's managed, what's the harvesting, etc. And then trees and shrubs are treated slightly differently than the soils and grasses, and we use a tool that's already approved by the American Carbon Registry for use, called the Carbon Pools and Emission Sources tool, and within that there's a field measurement approach to assessing carbon stock changes in trees and shrubs. So as I said, we divide it between the soil carbon and carbon stored in grasses and the carbon stores in trees and shrubs. We use a process model for the soil carbon and grass storage, and then we use field measurement through the ACR tool for trees and shrubs. So on the model basis, we don't define exactly which model has to be used. We want to leave that open to users, giving greater flexibility and not being overly prescriptive. But examples would include Century or Dacent or Rothsey, and there are others out there as well. In order to use a specific model in your project area, there have to be studies, for example, journal articles showing that the model's been used in the region. It doesn't have to be in exactly the specific area, but it has to be in the region to demonstrate it is applicable. The model must be able to determine soil carbon at a specified depth, and has to also consider the current vegetation and the productivity of that vegetation, the management of the vegetation, including the tillage, livestock, including the presence, number, type of livestock, and any manure coming from that livestock or additionally added to the land. Modeling the grasses themselves or any herbaceous vegetation is an optional capability, but if it's present in the model, then the module requires that it be used. As an added safety net to prove the applicability of the results, there is some validation of the model with limited field data sampling, but it's very limited data sampling just to show that the numbers are in line with expectations. the carbon pools and emission sources tool is for the trees and shrubs. There's field measurements, so it would require going out there and measuring the trees on a limited sampling basis. The baseline stocks would be equal to the stocks at the start of the project, and then any additional growth of those trees beyond that would be sequestration achieved by the project. Then on to the Enteric module at the large scale. Again, under the same conditions, enteric emissions must be included where the project leads to higher emissions than occurred in the absence of the project. In all other cases, it would be optional. So there could be cases where there are lower emissions from enteric fermentation, but the choice is made not to include it because of any consideration the project has. In any situation where the project has led to reductions in enteric emissions, it is optional to include. But you have to include it if it's the other way around. And this large-scale module has to be used under the same criteria. If it's within the US and emissions are more than, well, currently that's not entirely correct because we're currently using COMET 2.0. If it's in the US and emissions are more than 5,000, then the large scale has to be used. And in the future, it'll be if it's more than 60,000. And then internationally, where emissions are more than 5,000. Data inputs would be the number of livestock, the weight of those, body weight of those livestock, information on the feed of the livestock. So the annual diet composition as a percentage by feed, the dietary ether extract, the gross energy intake, and the dietary neutral detergent fiber, so chemistry results from the feed. The calculations are divided in 3 by lactating cows, dry cows, and heifers and steers, and the entire calculation approach is devised from a large series of data collected by the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Beltsville, Maryland between 1963 and 1995, with the analysis largely done by UC Davis in California. So there is no process model required here. It's just a set of equations that you have to feed in the data that's requested, and out will come the emissions in both the business as usual and the project scenarios. So moving on to the large-scale manure module. Again, you have to include it where the project leads to an increase in emissions, a significant increase in emissions, and the ex-ante tool would be the determinant of this. In any other case, it's optional. Again, this is incorrect. In the US, where there are direct emissions of more than 5,000 currently, anywhere in the world actually where there are emissions of more than 5,000 tons of carbon dioxide annually, you would have to use the large scale. As a small scale module, as the small scale module evolves, and we are able to use Comet Farm, then that would change within the US to more than 60,000. The inputs in the A-MANURE module are the type of manure management system, the feces quantity production, the properties of the feces, particularly volatile, solid content, and pH, quantities of manure in storage and any losses from storage, and the ambient temperature either in the barns or in the storage system. The calculations are based on the model Dairy Gem, but in our assessment of Dairy Gem, we could see that there wasn't a complex process modeling occurring for these categories. It was the application of equations. And so rather than requiring users to have expertise in the model, we pulled out the equations and just present them directly in the module. We have a dynamic bed baseline, which is also true for the enteric, so that if the livestock numbers or the quantity of manure changes, then you have to consider both the baseline and the project cases. And also it's very much dependent on the atmospheric, the climatic conditions in the current moment for determining both what the business as usual emissions would have been and what the project emissions are. We consider emissions from manure for carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide is solely for flaring of methane from enclosed manure storage. Methane is emissions from barn floors and open lots. Any stored manure, so this will be covered, uncovered, or in dry stacks. Any manure applied to fields, and any manure direct from grazing animals. And the nitrous oxide emissions are from barn floors or dry lots and unenclosed storage of manure or stacked dry manure. The final large-scale module is the fertilizer module. has to be included again where the project leads to significant increases in emissions from fertilizer. If your project leads to a decrease in emissions from fertilizer, it is optional. And the large-scale module, A-fertilizer, has to be used if you're in the US and direct emissions are more than 60,000 tons annually, and internationally where they're more than 5,000 tons annually. Data inputs would typically be atmospheric factors such as temperature and rainfall, etc., and concentrations of gases in the atmosphere, etc. Daily meteorology, edaphic factors such as the soil types and factors associated with the soil, cropping factors, tillage factors, date and depth of tillage, fertilizer application factors, the type and rate of application particularly being critical for assessment of fertilizer emissions, and then anything to do with irrigation. As with the soil carbon module, we chose to not require a specific model to allow flexibility for users, but there are multiple process models out there and one has to be used. For example, DNTC or DACENT would be applicable. Again, you have to demonstrate the model is appropriate for the region in which the project's being located, and you have to quantify both the direct and the indirect emissions resulting from the fertilizer. And the output has to be the emission at a specific point in time. So the direct emissions are the emissions that come directly from the fertilizer on the site where it's applied, and indirect emissions would be emissions resulting from leaching or from volatilization of the fertilizer. We also require consideration of emissions that happen during fertilizer production. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Lauren to talk about leakage.
Okay. So I'm going to cover the leakage accounting for this methodology in the next few slides. Leakage can be defined as a decrease in sequestration or increase in emissions outside project boundaries as a result of the project implementation. As Nick mentioned earlier, there are two kinds of leakage, both of which are covered in this module: activity shifting leakage and market effects leakage. Activity shifting leakage is it's basically caused by the shifting of activities of people within the project area. So when the drivers of the baseline emissions that operated in the area before the project start date are effectively relocated to another area outside of the project boundary during the project period. So those emissions associated with the relocated activities are still present, and although outside the project boundaries, they must be taken into account. Market effects leakage is caused by the shifts in supply and demand for the project and services affected by the project. So when project activities result in reduced output, it is assumed that the market-mediated supply and demand responses will lead to some proportion of the project's output from within the project boundary being replaced in the marketplace by other producers outside the project boundary. And of course, this response would come with associated emissions that could effectively negate some of the GHG emission reductions attributable to the project activities. Okay. Can you shift to the next slide? So in this particular case, the leakage accounting module, the purpose is basically to estimate the GHG emissions reductions that are caused by both the activity shifting and market effects leakage related to grazing land livestock management project activities. This module, the leakage accounting, is applicable to all project activities, and therefore all projects must assess whether there is a potential for leakage and whether or not calculations for either one or both types are necessary. The module is absolutely required where the project leads to a decrease greater than 3% in output relative to the baseline case. So, and in this case, the baseline yield is determined based on the average output for the 5 years prior to the project start date. So, ideally, if this data would be obtainable and the average would be calculable, if the 5 years of historic data is not available, then the baseline yield will be determined based on common practice. And in this case, the common practice would be defined and based on publicly available verifiable data from peer-reviewed publications, USDA, National Agricultural Statistics Service, university extension publications, or expert opinion. Next slide. Oh, okay. Accounting for activity shifting leakage is required where, as I said before, the output baseline, or excuse me, the baseline output exceeds project output by 3%, and also the baseline landowner or user purchases new fields, brings new fields into production, increases livestock population outside the project boundaries, or is displaced from the project area. So if any of those types of activities occur, then this accounting methodology, the activity shifting leakage must be calculated. So when accounting for activity shifting is required, the project proponent must monitor all the livestock operations of the baseline landowners and users. Again, if the production is, it should be reported if possible. If it's not possible, then common practice for the production would be used and used to determine the per unit area or per head emissions and estimates of numbers of head in the case where real data was not available. In order to calculate the emissions associated with the activity shifting leakage, you use the same methods that are outlined in the emissions modules that have just been described. So all of the, whether it's microscale, small scale, enteric, manure, fertilizer, or biotic, depending on the magnitude of the emissions reductions, those are the same calculation methodologies that you would employ for calculating the activity shifting leakage. And therefore, the full activity shifting leakage emissions would then be simply the summed emissions from each module from newly farmed lands or increases in livestock populations outside the project boundary. Okay, moving on to market effects leakage. Accounting for marketing effects leakage is required only when the baseline output exceeds the project output by 3%. And the accounting method here attempts to capture those emissions associated with the market-mediated responses of the producers outside the project boundary, as I described earlier. It employs the theory that market effects leakage can be quantified using published estimates of price elasticities of supply and demand, where based on a paper by Murray et al., and where price elasticities describe how a change in price affects the quantity supplied or demanded. Okay, so the market effects leakage factor the module defines the default market effects leakage factor that is applicable to any project using this methodology. It uses the following derived equation whereby the market effects leakage factor is basically the ratio of the difference between the price elasticities of demand and supply to the price elasticity of supply. Price elasticities for both supply and demand for the dairy and beef sector have been derived and published in several peer-reviewed economic studies, and we have referenced them in the module for both the U.S. dairy and U.S. beef cattle sector. So any projects that are located in the U.S. must use the referenced values here. Any projects located outside the U.S. Must use verifiable values for the elasticity of supply and demand based on peer-reviewed studies and local market data. So the net greenhouse gas emissions due to market effects leakage are derived from the difference in the output of milk or beef between the baseline and the project. Any additional output from production shifted to non-project areas, which is effectively the activity shifting value, the market leakage factor, and the baseline greenhouse gas emissions per unit output, which is that particularly is derived from the baseline greenhouse gas emissions of each applicable sources, sink, or reservoir, which are outputs of the other accounting modules. So the baseline greenhouse gas emissions per unit output is the summed emissions, baseline emissions divided by the baseline output, very simply. So I won't go into, you can see the equation that's used here. I won't go into each of the variables here in any more detail, but just we wanted to point out that in theory it is possible that the sum of the project output and output from production shifted to non-project areas it could be greater than the baseline output. And so in that case, the positive leakage, what was called positive leakage, may optionally be calculated. And you can see that, I will go to the next slide, showing the simple equation of summing the market effects leakage and the activity shifting leakage to arrive at the total leakage deduction. So you can see here if the market effects leakage is negative and activity shifting leakage is 0, then the total emissions deduction will be a negative, and therefore there would be a positive leakage opportunity. And we've chosen to leave that as an optional quantification in the methodology so far. I think that is it on leakage, and I'm going to pass it back over to Nick Martin for a question and answer.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. We have about 25 minutes left for question and answer. I wanted to just at the start repeat, in case folks didn't hear, you can either click the hand button to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question yourself, or you can type your question into your chat box, and that will come through to us, and I'll ask the question of the appropriate person. So let's start with a fairly general question. What effect does climate have on overall emission reduction tons? Will there be more ERTs generated in the southeast as opposed to drier Midwest climates? Tim, I think I'll give that one to you if you have an answer to that.
Yes, so the question was, how does the climate conditions affect the emission reductions? Is that right?
Yes. Would more emission reductions be generated in the southeast, for example, than the drier Midwest? And I suppose this depends in part on what practices are being carried out. But.
Yeah, I mean, it would be too hard to make a blanket statement like that. But you know, there will be effects. You know, rainfall certainly has a heavy effect on what's going to happen with the fertilizer, and also with manure emissions if they're on the grasslands. Temperature has an effect on emissions from manure. Also has an effect on enteric emissions on some level, and certainly manure emissions, fertilizer emissions. It'll affect soil carbon. So these are highly complex and overlapping and issues. So I wouldn't want to make a blanket statement, but it certainly will have an impact.
Good, thank you. Can this project type, I think what's meant is, can this methodology be used for avoided conversion of grasslands to urban development? Or is it only for avoided conversion of grasslands to croplands? I can answer that one. It's not for either. The avoided conversion of grasslands to some other land use is not one of the eligible activities here, and I'm sorry, I think I inadvertently skipped one of my slides on applicability conditions. There is a current ACR methodology in development for avoided conversion of grasslands to croplands. That has been through public comment, is currently in peer review, and specifically addresses that topic of demonstrating a conversion threat of grasslands going to croplands, but that's not something that falls under this methodology. So neither conversion type is eligible here, is the answer to that question. Here's another one for Tim. There seems to be a choice of models in the fertilizer module. How would a project developer determine that any specific module is going to be acceptable under this methodology?
It's a matter of looking at the applicability conditions for applying the model, which are given in the specifically relevant modules, and then you could put forward a model and you would have to justify it to the verifier. So the modules hopefully are very clear on this. Here's the criteria the models have to meet, and if you can meet those, then you're fine to just go ahead.
So justifying a model to a verifier would be a matter of showing the verifier that the specified criteria for use of that module are met in the project, or the model has been calibrated for the project area and conditions, or things like that. What might be involved in that?
Yeah, so there are multiple levels, but I think we're talking first of all in terms of can this model be used at all for my project area? So there are going to be criteria for whether the model is acceptable in the first place. For example, does it consider soil carbon to a specific depth? Does it account for emissions associated or sequestration associated with changes in tillage practices, the vegetation type, etc., in terms of criteria for the model? And then is it applicable to the area? So are there studies showing that for the same edapho-climatic conditions the model has been used before and been shown to be applicable? If you then meet those criteria, then the model can be used, and then beyond that you have to justify that you're using it correctly to the verifier. So there are several steps, and this is always going to be in those large-scale modules where the emission is significant. And we wanted to take that level of complexity away where emissions are fairly small. So in the cases where the emission is tiny, you can still account it under the microscale. If you're within the US and it's a moderate-sized emission, then you can still use COMET in the small-scale module without any extra justification or required expertise in model use. But where we're talking about these large significant sources, and you either choose to use it or you're required to use it because your project is heavily increasing emissions, then you have to go these steps of picking, justifying, and demonstrating a model.
Okay. While we're on the topic of models, I'll ask another one related to that. You mentioned that that COMET 2.0 is used, which doesn't cover enteric and manure. Why was COMET Farm not used, or if it will be used, how do you anticipate that transition happening within the methodology?
The reason why it's not used. I actually haven't checked very recently, but the ability to account grassland and grazing land, changes in soil carbon, and also these emissions and emission reductions associated with enteric emissions and manure emissions were not currently available in the Comet Farms that were out there, Comet Farm versions that were out there for us to look at. And so we couldn't set the criteria or give the guidance on how it would be used. The moment it is publicly accessible, Nick, you can talk about the process for us altering the methodology, but it would be relatively simple. And if it happens before the approval process is completed with under the ACR, then that's something we can do under the approval process.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point, Tim. I could say a little bit more there that, you know, if this methodology goes through the full approval process without Comet Farm being available, then it will specify Comet 2.0, and in that case, what could happen, you know, a few months later is an update to the methodology, shifting that to Comet Farm. But it could be the case that, you know, I know that the folks at Colorado State are very busily working away to make that available, and I think if it becomes available in a form that we can use even before the peer review is done, you know, this methodology is currently out for public comment, but then has to go through peer review. We would try to shift that over immediately as soon as we felt that shift could be made, and make that Comet Farm would then become part of what the peer reviewers are looking at to satisfy themselves on the use of Comet Farm in the small-scale accounting module. So thank you, Tim, for that point. Here's a question. Many livestock in the U.S. are grazed on public lands. What are the provisions for it? You know, can this methodology be used at all when livestock are grazed on public lands, and what are the conditions related to that? I'll take this one. Again, there was a slide I think I may have skipped where we talked about applicability conditions. This question was brought up to us by our committee, or a similar question. So recognizing that a lot of livestock are run on public lands for part of the year, the decision we've made thus far is to say that you know, for those activities, reductions in enteric, manure, fertilizer, or fossil fuel emissions related to those projects, those are fine, and you know, as long as the project proponent can demonstrate clear control and ownership of those emission reductions, there are no additional requirements. If the project is seeking to claim credit for biotic sequestration that's happening, greater biotic sequestration on public lands due to changes in their grazing management, the project proponent in that case, in order to claim credit for that, has to demonstrate that the responsible agency cedes offset ownership to the project proponent. And different federal, you know, the different federal agencies that manage the most acres of public lands in the U.S. are at different points, I think, in their policy setting process regarding carbon projects on those lands. Distinct from the issue of ownership of carbon, there's an issue of you know, the public agencies taking on a multi-year commitment to manage carbon on public lands and mitigate reversals. And for that reason, you know, guessing that while you might be able to get a public agency to cede carbon ownership, you probably would not be able to get a letter from a public agency committing to manage carbon stocks set aside in a buffer for the minimum project term. What we said is that in the case of projects on public lands that are wanting to claim credit for biotic sequestration, they must make the buffer contribution in non-project ERTs, which is an option for all projects registered on ACR. If they want to make a buffer contribution in tons from a different project, they can do that. That's a sort of a flexibility mechanism and a way to strengthen the overall robustness of the buffer for projects in general. But these projects are actually required to do that. So since you probably won't have the public agency being willing to back up the carbon that's coming from the project itself and is held is an asset held on public lands, in this case you're required to make that buffer contribution in non-project ERTs, which are obviously going to be from some other type of project elsewhere. So that's the public lands question. There are some similar provisions in the applicability conditions related to carbon on leased grazing lands, which might not be the public, of course, and if the project proponent and project participants are not the owners of those lands, they can still claim credit for biotic sequestration if they can demonstrate that the landowner has ceded offset title and has agreed not to change land use for the minimum project term. So the owner doesn't have to agree to monitor and verify carbon. That's a commitment that has to be made by the project proponent, but the owner does have to agree not to change those grazing lands into some other use. So some more details there on land types. Here's a question on this relates to additionality. How would one determine if the adoption rate of any given practice is above or below the 5% threshold for the project area? And how specific does the project area need to be? I guess I'll answer this one as well. That was in the framework module that I presented. As I said, there's no, well, there's two ways in which this threshold test appears in that module. One is for the purposes of projects on a positive list deemed additional, and so we did not, as I mentioned, we didn't find data to show that, for example, rotational grazing in a particular state or region of the country is at less than 5% adoption, and therefore we put that on the positive list. We just created the option for that to happen, and that could be done through publicly available data, National Agricultural Statistics Service or other data. It could be done through actual surveys of ranchers conducted by the project proponent, and it could be done as well through expert opinion that's demonstrated and justified to the validator. The second way this threshold idea appears is in the early adopters provisions, and the ways of demonstrating baseline adoption rate. In that case, it's baseline adoption rate for the purposes of showing that a particular practice is at less than 5% adoption, and therefore early adopters of that practice should be able to use a common practice baseline. But the way of showing that would be similar. Publicly available data, surveys conducted by the project proponent, surveys of experts. There's a buffer built in so that if one is relying on expert opinion, one has to actually show that the adoption rate is significantly lower than 5%, since one is not conducting a survey. So those are some of the ways that data is collected. Now there was a related question about why this 5%. That seems like a very low number to be considered common practice, and I think that's something that we've heard frequently, and we agree with that perspective on one level. On another level, we've tried to be extremely conservative with that threshold, so that for a couple of reasons. One, because there is obviously some uncertainty in those kinds of data. So a project, we wanted to set the threshold low enough so that if the actual adoption rate was in fact 7 or 8%, we would account for the fact that there's uncertainty there by requiring it according to surveys to be lower. And secondly, because this is used in the context of allowing crediting to early adopters, which is a measure that is controversial, disputed by some groups, vehemently supported by others in the producer community. Since we were looking for a mechanism to do that, on the actual threshold, we decided to be very conservative. This is something that we are, I'm sure we will get comment from on both sides of the issue in our public comments, and we'll see how that position evolves. Here's one more for Tim. Tim, are existing or planted trees required to be measured for all activities, or all projects, I guess?
No, that's not true at all. The only time you'd be required to measure them is if you were going to cause a significant decrease in their stocks. And so if those trees are just growing and therefore sequestering carbon, then we would expect no difference between the baseline and the project, and there would be no need to account. If the project was somehow able to increase the sequestration of trees and shrubs, again, it would be up to the project to determine whether to include it. The conservative nature of the methodology and of the accounting approach is just such that accounting is required where you cause increases in emissions compared to business as usual. And then it's up to the project if they want to take credit for decreases or in emissions or increases in sequestration the project causes.
Great, thank you. Here's one that either, I think, Nancy, Tim, you could answer. What about a project? Is a project eligible that is doing it's simply installing a dairy manure digester or using other changes to a manure management system? Is that eligible under this methodology, or does that fall under other project-specific methodologies?
I guess I can have a go. And Nick, you can speak to this as well. In theory, it could be accounted under this methodology. In any case, when you're doing a project methodology, you have often more than one methodology available, and you want to choose the methodology that's best suited. In this case, the methodology is designed for grassland and grazing land, but handling of the manure is part of the accounting, and so the ability to do that sort of project is included in my mind. Nick, do you have any different thoughts?
No, I think that's just the way I would answer that one. There are specific methodologies for that, where you can register a project. There's a specific California compliance protocol for that. So if you're interested just in doing that activity and creating compliance offsets, we'd certainly recommend you use that, the California Air Resources Board protocol. But for other things that are not eligible, either other changes in manure management system or other entirely different livestock activities that are not included under that protocol, this methodology allows a lot more latitude. Okay, I think that's all the questions that I have here. If anyone else has a question that you're burning to have answered, you can raise your hand. But seeing none, I think we'll conclude the webinar at this point. I wanted to reiterate that, or just encourage everyone again to comment if you can. There's still an opportunity to provide written comments until the January 31st. This methodology is open for public comment, and we'd very much encourage you to do that. This is a draft where we're looking for feedback as much as possible from producers, from project developers, and others on what we're putting forward here as a methodology. So we'd appreciate that. And I think that's it. We'll wrap up here. Thanks again to everyone for taking the time to participate, and thanks in particular to Tim, Nancy, and Lauren for presenting.